The scream cut through the crystal chandeliers like a blade through silk. Lord Edmund Blackwood collapsed against the marble floor of the great hall, his fingers clawing at his chest, his face draining of colour until his lips turned blue. 200 guests froze in their waltz positions, violins scratched into silence. But across the endless stretch of polished floor, near the towering windows draped in burgundy velvet, a woman smiled. Not a cruel smile. Not the smile of someone who took pleasure in suffering. It was the smile of recognition, the smile of someone who had seen this exact horror before and knew precisely what hid beneath it. Alexander Blackwood, the Duke of Ravenscourt, dropped to his knees beside his younger brother. At 35, Alexander carried the weight of his title with the same rigidity he carried his spine, straight and unyielding, even now as panic coiled in his chest like a living snake. He tore at Edmund's cravat, the black silk coming loose under desperate fingers. Edmund's eyes rolled back. His body convulsed once, twice, then went horribly still. "Send for the physician," Alexander commanded, his voice low and terrible enough to send a footman scrambling toward the service stairs. Guests pressed backward, a wave of silk and horror creating a wide circle around the fallen man. Alexander pressed 2 fingers to Edmund's throat. A pulse, thready and too fast, fluttered against his fingertips like a trapped bird. "Edmund," Alexander said, his voice cracking only on the second syllable. "Edmund, look at me." Nothing. A rustle of moss-green wool caught the edge of Alexander's vision. He looked up, ready to snarl at whoever dared intrude upon his brother's dying moment. But the words died in his throat. The woman from across the hall knelt on the marble without hesitation, her dark hair falling over one shoulder in a loose black wave that seemed to absorb the candlelight rather than reflect it. Her eyes were dark, intense, and absolutely focused on Edmund's face. "He is not dying," she said, her voice low and steady, the accent faintly Scottish, clipped and precise. "Not yet, but he will be if you let them bleed him." Alexander stared at her. She was young, perhaps 23, with skin like fresh cream and cheekbones that spoke of breeding but not wealth. Her hands, already reaching for Edmund's wrist, were not the soft hands of a lady. They were practical hands, scarred at the knuckles, the nails cut short. "Who are you?" Alexander demanded. "Someone who recognizes belladonna poisoning when she sees it," she replied, not looking at him. She pulled Edmund's eyelid back with a gentleness that contradicted her boldness. The pupil was dilated, a black hole swallowing the blue iris. "How long since he drank the champagne?" Alexander's mind reeled. "The champagne? The toast was 20 minutes ago. Then we have perhaps 3 hours before the paralysis reaches his lungs." She released Edmund's wrist and finally met Alexander's eyes. Her gaze was unflinching, the dark depth steady as stone. "My name is Miss Eleanor Ashford. My father was Dr. Thomas Ashford of Edinburgh. I know how to save your brother, Your Grace. But I require complete control for the next 72 hours. No interference from your London physicians. No bleeding. No purging with mercury." A murmur rippled through the watching crowd. A woman issuing medical commands? A woman demanding authority over a duke? Alexander felt the familiar armor of his title settling over his shoulders, the instinct to dismiss her, to have the butler remove this impertinent creature from his sight. But Edmund's breath was coming in shallow, desperate gasps against the marble. His brother, the only person who had ever made Alexander laugh without calculation, was slipping away. "And if you fail?" Alexander heard himself ask. "Then I shall leave London forever and never practice medicine again," Eleanor said. The words should have sounded dramatic, theatrical. Instead, they landed with the weight of a contract. "But if I succeed, Your Grace, you will grant me something in return." "Name it." "A position, not as a servant, as a resident physician in the charity hospital you are building in Whitechapel. I want to treat patients, women and children who die every day because no qualified doctor will cross their threshold." The audacity of her request stole what little breath Alexander had managed to recover. The hospital was his secret project, not yet announced, discussed only in closed ledgers and midnight meetings with architects. He looked at her with new eyes, seeing not just the impertinence, but the steel beneath it. "You have a wager, Miss Ashford," Alexander said. 72 hours, beginning now." Eleanor nodded. She turned to the footman hovering nearby. "I need charcoal, powdered calcium carbonate, egg whites and warm water. Immediately, and clear this room. Your brother needs air, not spectators." As the hall emptied in a rustle of scandalized whispers, Alexander watched her work. She positioned Edmund on his side with practiced efficiency, her fingers checking his pulse again, her eyes tracking the rise and fall of his chest. She moved with the certainty of someone who had done this not once, but 100 times, who had watched death try to take what she refused to surrender. "Why did you smile?" Alexander asked, the question escaping before he could cage it. Eleanor paused, her hands stilled on Edmund's collar, straightening it with an almost tender gesture. "Because I knew I could help him," she said softly, "and because for the first time in 3 years, knowing something made me feel less alone." She looked up then, and in the candlelight, Alexander saw the cost of that knowledge etched in the faint shadows beneath her eyes, in the tightness of her jaw. She was afraid, he realized. She was terrified. She simply refused to let the fear win. "Help me carry him to a private room," she said. "We have work to do, Your Grace." "And the clock is already running." Alexander lifted his brother in his arms, feeling Edmund's weight, the terrifying fragility of him. For 35 years, he had controlled every aspect of his life with the precision of a military campaign. His estates, his investments, his political alliances, all arranged like chess pieces on a board he never lost. Now, in the space of 3 minutes, a woman in a worn wool gown had upended the board entirely. He followed her up the grand staircase, her moss-green skirt sweeping the carpet, her back straight as a blade. Behind them, the great hall lay empty except for a spilled glass of champagne, its golden contents seeping into the marble like a secret. 3 days, 72 hours, a wager that could cost his brother's life or grant a strange woman her impossible dream. Alexander had never been a gambling man. But as he laid Edmund on the bed in the East Wing's finest guest chamber, he found himself praying to a god he had long ignored that this particular gamble would not destroy them both. Eleanor immediately began unpacking a small leather satchel she had produced from somewhere, her movements quick and economic. She mixed powders in a crystal tumbler, her hands steady despite the gravity of the moment. Alexander watched her measure quantities with the eye of someone who had memorized ratios in the dead of night, by candlelight, without the benefit of formal schooling. "You do not trust me," she said. It was not a question. "I do not know you," Alexander corrected. "You know that I identified poisoning in under a minute while your guests were still fainting from shock. You know that I did not hesitate when every instinct in this room screamed for propriety and distance." She stirred the mixture with a silver spoon, her eyes on the swirling liquid. "Trust is earned, Your Grace. I intend to earn yours before dawn." She approached the bed, and Alexander stepped aside, a movement so automatic it surprised him. He had not voluntarily yielded ground to anyone in a decade. Eleanor slid one arm beneath Edmund's shoulders, lifting him with a strength that belied her slender frame. She pressed the tumbler to his lips. "Drink," she commanded softly. "Fight." Edmund's throat worked convulsively. Some of the mixture spilled down his chin, but more went down. Eleanor repeated the process again and again, her patience infinite, her focus absolute. Alexander stood by the window, watching the moonlight silver the rooftops of Grosvenor Square, listening to the sound of his brother's labored breathing and the quiet, relentless persistence of a woman who had no intention of losing. The 72 hours had begun. Morning came to Grosvenor Square with the grey reluctance of a London winter, the fog pressing against the windows like a living thing. Eleanor had not slept. She sat in a chair drawn close to Edmund's bed, her moss-green gown rumpled, her black hair escaping its pins to fall in loose waves around her shoulders. She had changed the mixture twice during the night, adjusted the pillows 7 times, and forced 3 more doses of the activated charcoal down Edmund's throat. Alexander entered the room at dawn, still dressed in the midnight blue tailcoat he had worn to the ball, his cravat loosened, his dark hair disheveled. He looked like a man who had spent the night pacing corridors rather than sleeping in his ducal bed. "Any change?" he asked, his voice rough. Eleanor looked up. Her eyes were shadowed, the dark intensity dulled by exhaustion, but her gaze remained sharp. "His pulse has stabilized. The vomiting stopped 2 hours ago. But the toxin is not fully cleared. He will need constant monitoring for the next 48 hours. Alexander approached the bed, his boots silent on the carpet. Edmund looked better, he had to admit. Colour had returned to his cheeks, and his breathing, while still shallow, no longer carried the rattle of death. "You have not left his side," Alexander observed. "Neither have you from the sound of your footsteps in the corridor." A ghost of something almost like appreciation crossed Alexander's face. He moved to the window, pulling back the curtain to let in the weak morning light. "The physician I sent for last night arrived an hour ago. Dr. Halloway. He insists on examining Edmund. He is the personal doctor to 3 members of the House of Lords." Eleanor's hands stilled on the blanket she was adjusting. "Does Dr. Halloway believe in bleeding for belladonna poisoning?" "He believes in the humoral theory, yes." "Then Dr. Halloway will kill your brother." Eleanor stood, her spine straight despite the fatigue that weighted her shoulders. "The wager was for 72 hours of my complete control. If you permit him to interfere, you forfeit the wager and likely Edmund's life." Alexander turned to face her. In the grey light, she looked impossibly young and impossibly weary, a contradiction in wool and determination. "You asked me to trust an unknown woman over a man who has served my family for 15 years. I ask you to trust results over titles." Eleanor stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender and something sharper, medicinal, clinging to her skin. "Your brother's body is fighting a war, Your Grace. Every hour that passes without further poisoning is a battle won. But if someone opens his veins now, he will not have the strength to survive the next wave." Alexander studied her face, searching for deception, for the telltale signs of an opportunist seizing a moment of crisis. He found none. Only the same unyielding certainty he had seen when she smiled across a hall full of death. "Dr. Halloway will be told that his services are not required at this time," Alexander said. Eleanor's shoulders dropped almost imperceptibly, the only sign of relief she permitted herself. "Thank you. Do not thank me yet. We are only 20 hours into your 3 days." The day unfolded with a tension that made the air in the room feel thin. Eleanor worked with the methodical precision of a clockmaker, her hands moving from task to task without wasted motion. She prepared fresh mixtures, monitored Edmund's pulse with fingers that seemed to read secrets from his skin, and changed the cool compresses on his forehead with a rhythm that suggested ritual rather than routine. Alexander found himself unable to leave. He told himself it was vigilance, that he was guarding his brother from a potential charlatan, but as the hours passed, he remained not out of suspicion, but out of something more complicated. He watched her work, and he saw the way she touched Edmund's hand when she thought no one was looking, the way her lips moved in a silent incantation that might have been prayer or might have been medical memorization. 3 days, she whispered once, so softly he almost missed it. He realized it was her refrain, the anchor she returned to when doubt pressed close. By afternoon, Edmund stirred. His eyes opened, unfocused and glassy, but open. He looked at the canopy above him, then turned his head and found Eleanor watching him. "You are not dead," she said gently. "Disappointed?" Edmund's voice was a rasp, barely audible. "Delighted. It would have ruined my reputation." A weak laugh shook Edmund's frame, followed by a cough. Eleanor was immediately there, supporting his shoulders, offering water from a glass with a steady hand. Alexander watched the interaction from his chair by the fire, something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. His brother, who had been raised to command servants and expect obedience, was looking at this strange woman with an expression of tentative trust. "What happened?" Edmund asked. "Someone poisoned your champagne," Alexander said, rising to approach the bed. "Miss Ashford saved your life. You owe her a debt." Edmund's eyes widened, the blue clearing slowly. "Poisoned. Belladonna," Eleanor confirmed. "A precise dose, not enough to kill immediately, but enough to ensure a very public, very horrifying death within hours. Whoever did this wanted you to suffer visibly." The implication hung in the air like smoke. This was not a crime of passion. It was an assassination attempt, disguised as illness, designed to eliminate Edmund while casting no suspicion on the true architect. Alexander felt the familiar coldness of political calculation settling over his mind, the part of him that had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of the aristocracy since childhood. "You are certain?" "I am certain of the poison. I am certain of the dosage. What I am not certain of," Eleanor said, her dark eyes meeting his, "is who in this house had the knowledge and opportunity to administer it. And that, Your Grace, is a question I cannot answer with medicine." She turned back to Edmund, adjusting his pillows with a tenderness that seemed automatic, unstudied. "Rest now. Your body has fought a great battle. Let it recover." As Edmund drifted back into sleep, Alexander remained standing by the bed, his mind racing through the guest list, the servants, the suppliers. Someone in his own home had tried to murder his brother, and the only person standing between Edmund and a second attempt was a woman with no credentials, no letters of introduction, and nothing but her own formidable intellect to shield them. "The 72 hours," Eleanor said quietly, not looking at him. "They are not just for healing. They are for finding who did this, because if they tried once and failed, they will try again." Alexander looked at her profile, sharp and determined against the fading light. "You are not merely a physician, Miss Ashford. You are a strategist. I am a woman who has learned that knowledge is the only armor that cannot be taken away." She finally turned to him, and in her eyes he saw the reflection of battles he could not imagine, struggles fought in Edinburgh's back alleys and lecture halls that had never accepted her presence. "And I intend to keep your brother alive, Your Grace. Not because of our wager, but because I have seen too many deaths that could have been prevented by someone simply choosing to care." The evening shadows stretched across the room, and somewhere in the house below, a clock chimed the hour. 30 hours gone, 42 remained. The obstacle arrived on the second morning in the form of Lady Cordelia Ashford, Eleanor's aunt by marriage, and the distant relation who had secured her invitation to the ball. She swept into the sick-room with the force of a winter gale, her burgundy silk gown rustling like judgment, her greying hair arranged in coils that seemed to tighten with indignation. "This is unconscionable," Lady Cordelia declared, her voice carrying the precise pitch of aristocratic scandal. "A young woman, unmarried, alone in a room with 2 men, one of them a duke? Eleanor, you will return to my house immediately." Eleanor did not look up from the mixture she was preparing. "Edmund's condition remains critical. I cannot leave." "You are not a physician. You are not even a nurse. You are a gently bred woman who has read too many books and forgotten her place." Lady Cordelia turned to Alexander, her expression softening into something performatively sympathetic. "Your Grace, surely you see the impropriety. My niece's reputation will be protected by my name," Alexander interrupted, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Miss Ashford remains here under my explicit protection and authority. She is attempting to save my brother's life. I will not have her distracted by social conventions that seem remarkably less urgent than murder." Lady Cordelia's mouth opened, then closed. She was not accustomed to being overridden, least of all by a duke defending a nobody. 48 hours, Eleanor said softly, her refrain barely audible. What? Her aunt demanded. Nothing. Eleanor finally looked up, her dark eyes steady. Aunt Cordelia, I appreciate your concern for my reputation, but 3 years ago I watched my mother die of sepsis because the physician refused to listen when I told him his instruments were unclean. I swore then that I would never again allow propriety to cost a life. If that makes me unmarriageable, so be it. I would rather be useful than respectable. The words fell into the room like stones into still water. Alexander felt the weight of them, the accumulated grief and fury compressed into a statement of absolute resolve. He saw Lady Cordelia recoil, saw the calculation in her eyes as she realized that Eleanor had moved beyond her control, possibly beyond the control of anyone. You will regret this, Lady Cordelia said, but the venom had leached from her voice, replaced by something colder. When society closes its doors, do not come knocking on mine. She swept out, the door closing with a decisive click that seemed to seal Eleanor's fate as surely as any judgment. Silence followed. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she resumed her mixing. Alexander noticed the tremor, the first crack in her armor he had witnessed. Your aunt is wrong, he said. About which part? All of it, but particularly the part about you not being a physician. He moved closer, stopping at the edge of the table where she worked. I have watched you for 2 days, Miss Ashford. I have seen you diagnose what trained men missed, calculate dosages with the precision of a chemist, and comfort a man who should, by every medical standard, be dead. You are more of a physician than any man who has ever attended my family. Eleanor's hands stilled. She looked at him, and for a moment the professional mask slipped, revealing a young woman who had waited years to hear those words from someone with the power to make them matter. Thank you, she whispered. Do not thank me. Thank me when Edmund walks out of this room. The test came that afternoon. Edmund's fever spiked suddenly, his skin burning beneath Eleanor's fingertips, his breathing growing rapid and shallow. She recognized the signs immediately, the body's final attempt to purge the remaining toxin, a reaction that could tip either into recovery or collapse. The charcoal is not enough anymore, she said, her voice tight but controlled. I need to administer a draught of pilocarpus. It will induce sweating, force the poison out through his pores. But his heart is weak. If the dose is wrong, it could kill him. Alexander stood at the foot of the bed, his knuckles white where they gripped the bedpost. What do you need? Precision, speed, and for you to hold his hand so he knows he is not alone in the dark. He measured the tincture with hands that betrayed nothing of the stakes. 3 drops. 4. Her lips moved, counting, her internal refrain not of days now, but of drops, of milligrams, of life measured in the smallest possible increments. Alexander took Edmund's hand, feeling the bones beneath the fevered skin, remembering the boy who had once clung to him during thunderstorms. I am here, Eddie. Fight, please, fight. Eleanor administered the draught, her fingers gentle on Edmund's throat, ensuring he swallowed. Then they waited. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Edmund's body arched, a moan escaping his lips. Sweat broke across his forehead, his chest soaking the sheets. Eleanor wiped his brow, murmuring words that might have been medical instructions or might have been comfort. Alexander could not tell. Come on, she whispered. Come on. 30 minutes. 45. The fever raged like a battle, visible in the flush of Edmund's skin, the trembling of his limbs. Alexander held his brother's hand and felt the pulse racing, stumbling, then gradually, almost imperceptibly, steadying. An hour passed. The sweat began to cool. Edmund's breathing deepened, each inhale stronger than the last. Eleanor checked his pulse, her fingers pressing the artery in his neck, and when she looked up at Alexander, her dark eyes held a light he had not seen before. It is working, she said. The poison is leaving his body. He is going to live. Alexander felt something release in his chest, a tension he had carried since childhood, the belief that he must control everything, or lose everything. He looked at Eleanor, disheveled and exhausted and triumphant, and realized that for the first time in his life he had won not by commanding, but by trusting. 48 hours, she said, a smile touching her lips, the same smile he had seen across a hall full of death, but warmer now, directed at him. "And your brother is still breathing." The third day dawned with a clarity that felt like deception. The sky over London washed clean by overnight rain, the sun striking the windows of the East Wing with almost aggressive cheerfulness. Eleanor had allowed herself 2 hours of sleep in the chair, waking every 20 minutes to check Edmund's pulse, but by noon she permitted herself to believe that the crisis had passed. Edmund sat up in bed, pale but alert, accepting broth from a spoon with the complaining enthusiasm of a man who had survived against his own expectations. "You are insufferably smug for someone who nearly died," Alexander observed from his chair. "I have earned the right to be smug. I was poisoned." Edmund's voice was still thin, but the spark of irony had returned to his eyes. "Miss Ashford, you must let me thank you properly. When I am on my feet, I intend to—" The door burst open. Not opened, burst. The wood struck the wall with a crack that made Eleanor jump to her feet, her hand instinctively reaching for the glass tincture bottle on the nightstand. 3 men entered, led by Dr. Halloway, his face set in lines of righteous indignation, his medical bag clutched like a weapon. Behind him stood 2 broad-shouldered men in rough clothing, hired muscle wearing the livery of a private security firm. "Your Grace," Halloway said, addressing Alexander, but pointing a finger at Eleanor, "I have filed a formal complaint with the Royal College of Physicians. This woman has been practicing medicine without license, without training, and without authority. I am here to take Lord Edmund into proper care. These men will remove the charlatan." Alexander rose slowly, his full height imposing in the confined space, his shadow falling across the bed like a blade. "You enter my home uninvited, disturb my brother's recovery, and threaten a woman under my protection. You have 30 seconds to remove yourself before I have you thrown from the premises. With respect, Your Grace, the law is on my side." Halloway's smile was thin and satisfied. "A woman cannot be a physician. It is indecent, illegal, and dangerous. Lord Edmund requires proper male supervision. The college has authorized me to intervene." Eleanor felt the room tilt. She had known this moment might come, had prepared for it in the sleepless watches of the night. But preparation and reality were different countries, and she felt the cold hand of defeat closing around her throat. If they removed Edmund now, if they bled him or dosed him with their mercury purges, all her work would be undone. "He is not fully recovered," she said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her ribs. "If you move him, if you subject him to your treatments, you will kill him." "Silence!" Halloway snapped. "You have no voice here. Men, remove her." The hired men stepped forward. Alexander moved to intercept, but there were 2 of them, large and trained, and he was one man, however fierce. Eleanor did not retreat. She stepped between the men and Edmund's bed, her slender frame absurdly inadequate as a barrier, her dark hair wild around her shoulders, her moss-green gown stained with 3 days of medical labor. She looked like a madwoman, she knew. She looked exactly like the irrational female they expected her to be. "Touch him," she said, her voice dropping to a register that made even the hired men pause. "And I will scream this house down. I will tell every guest below stairs that Dr. Halloway attempted to murder Lord Edmund by preventing his treatment. I will write to every newspaper in London. I will stand in Parliament Square and announce that the Royal College values its pride more than its patients' lives. I have nothing to lose, gentlemen. I'm already ruined. But you have reputations, you have careers, you have everything to lose if this man dies under your care tonight." The men hesitated. Halloway's face purpled with rage. "You would not dare. Try me." Eleanor smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of someone who had already lost everything and discovered that the loss granted a terrible freedom. "We are at 58 hours, Your Grace," she said, not turning around. 2 hours remain. I need those 2 hours. Alexander looked at her, at the desperate courage of her stance, at the way she had turned her own destruction into a weapon. In that moment, he understood that he was not looking at a woman fighting for a wager. He was looking at a woman fighting for the right to exist in a world that had declared her impossible. "Dr. Holloway," Alexander said, his voice quiet and infinitely dangerous, "you have 10 seconds to leave. After that, I will exercise the ancient right of a peer of the realm to defend his household. These men may be large, my family has larger, and we have been killing people who threaten us since the Wars of the Roses." The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. Then Holloway spat on the carpet, turned and stormed out, his hired men following, with the uncomfortable shuffle of men who had not been paid enough for this particular violence. The door closed. Eleanor's knees buckled. She caught herself on the bedpost, her breath coming in shallow gasps, the adrenaline draining from her limbs and leaving her shaking. "Well," Edmund said weakly from the bed, "that was exciting. Shall we expect them back with a larger army?" "Not if they value their licenses," Alexander replied. He moved to Eleanor's side, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "You threatened to ruin yourself publicly, for a man you met 3 days ago, for a principle I have served my entire life." She straightened, her hand still gripping the bedpost. "And for a wager, I intend to win. 2 hours, Your Grace. Let us not waste them." The final 2 hours were the longest of Eleanor's life. She checked Edmund's pulse until her own fingers ached, administered the final doses of her remedies, and watched for any sign of relapse. But Edmund only grew stronger, sitting up straighter, color deepening in his cheeks, his eyes sharpening with the clarity of returning health. When the clock in the hall struck midnight, marking the end of the 72nd hour, Alexander was standing by the window. He turned as the last chime faded. "The wager is concluded," he said. "You have won, Miss Ashford." Eleanor sat down heavily in the chair she had occupied for 3 days. She felt empty, hollowed out by tension and exhaustion, but beneath the fatigue, a fire kindled. She had done it. Against poison, against convention, against the full weight of medical authority, she had saved a man's life. "I have a request," she said. "The position at the hospital, it is yours. I will draw up the papers tomorrow." "Thank you." "But that is not my request." She looked up at him, her dark eyes luminous in the lamplight. "I want to know who poisoned him, and I want to help you find them. Because if they tried once, they will try again. And next time, I may not be here to smile across the hall." Edmund slept through the morning of the 4th day, his body claiming the rest it had been denied. But by afternoon, he insisted on leaving his bed. Eleanor supervised his first steps with the vigilance of a general overseeing a fragile supply line, her hands ready to catch him, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "You hover," Edmund complained, though his smile took the sting from the words. "I have invested 72 hours in your survival. I will not see you tumble down the stairs for pride." Alexander watched them from the doorway of the drawing room, where Eleanor had insisted Edmund take his tea in the sunlight. The scene should have looked absurd. His brother, a grown man, being scolded like a child by a woman half his social standing. Instead, it looked natural. It looked right. "You are staring, Alexander," Edmund called without turning around. "It is rude. Come in and be social." Alexander entered, accepting the tea Eleanor poured with a grace that belied his internal turmoil. The past 3 days had stripped away layers of his own self-conception, revealing a man he was not certain he recognized. A man who had stood aside while a woman fought his battles. A man who had discovered that control was not the same as strength. "I have had the champagne glass analyzed," Alexander said, setting his cup aside. "The residue contained belladonna, as you said, but it also contained something else, a trace of laudanum, enough to slow Edmund's reflexes and ensure he could not call for help before the main poison took effect." Eleanor's brow furrowed. "Laudanum in the champagne? That suggests the poisoner wanted to ensure the victim could not fight back. It is not a typical combination. It is theatrical, designed to create a spectacle." Which is exactly what happened, Edmund said quietly. I was meant to die in front of 200 witnesses. A tragedy, but not a murder. An unfortunate accident, perhaps attributed to my constitution. Alexander nodded, his jaw tight. And the only person who would benefit from your public, natural-looking death, Eddie, is our cousin, Reginald. He is next in line after you. If you die without issue, the dukedom passes to him. The name hung in the air like smoke from a discharged pistol. Reginald Blackwood, the son of their father's younger brother, a man of desperate finances and desperate ambition, known for his gambling debts and his resentment of the main line. But proof, Eleanor said. We need proof. Suspicion is not enough against a member of the family. We need access to his rooms, Alexander agreed, and his recent correspondence. If he purchased Belladonna, there will be a record. I can get you inside his townhouse, Eleanor said. Both men looked at her. She set down her teacup with deliberate care, her dark eyes calculating. Reginald is known to visit certain establishments in Soho. I know someone who works in one of them, a woman named Maggie. She has cleaned his rooms. She knows where he hides his private papers. Eleanor met Alexander's gaze without flinching. If you give me a day, I can have the proof you need. Absolutely not, Alexander said, the words out before he could stop them. It is too dangerous. If Reginald discovers you, then I will be careful. Eleanor stood, her small frame radiating an authority that had nothing to do with physical size. Your Grace, you hired me to save your brother's life. I did. Now let me do what I am good at. I have spent years moving in the spaces between respectable society and the world that serves it. I know how to be invisible. I know how to listen, and I know how to retrieve what is needed without leaving a trace. Alexander wanted to argue. Every protective instinct he possessed, instincts honed by decades of guarding his family name and his brother's safety, screamed at him to forbid her, to lock her in the East Wing until the danger passed. But he looked at her, at the steel in her spine and the fire in her eyes, and he remembered how she had faced down 2 hired thugs without retreating a single step. One day, he said, and I am coming with you. You will be recognized. Then I will wear a disguise. I am told I make a convincing common laborer when I do not shave. Edmund laughed, a sound rich and healthy enough to make Eleanor's shoulders relax slightly. This is marvelous. A duke in disguise. A female physician playing spy. I'm almost glad I was poisoned. Do not say that, Eleanor and Alexander said simultaneously. They looked at each other, and for the first time since the scream in the hall, something warm and uncomplicated passed between them. The evening found them in a hired carriage, outside a narrow house in Soho. Alexander dressed in rough wool and a cap pulled low over his eyes. Eleanor in a plain brown cloak that rendered her anonymous. She had pinned her black hair severely back, and in the dim light, she looked like any of the thousands of working women who moved through London's shadows. Maggie will meet us in the alley, Eleanor whispered. She has the key to Reginald's rooms. He is at his club until midnight. They moved through the darkness with the silence of practiced necessity. Alexander followed Eleanor's lead, marveling at her confidence in this world so far removed from ballrooms and drawing rooms. She navigated the maze of Soho with the ease of someone who had walked these streets many times, who knew which doorways were safe and which harbored danger. Maggie was a thin woman with tired eyes and hands red from lye soap. She pressed a key into Eleanor's palm without a word, then melted back into the darkness. Reginald's rooms were on the 3rd floor, cramped and ostentatious, filled with furniture he could not afford and books he had never read. Eleanor went immediately to the desk, her fingers probing the drawers with methodical efficiency. Here, she said, pulling out a ledger, payment to a chemist in Lambeth for belladonna extract dated 3 days before the ball, and here a letter from a moneylender threatening exposure if his debts are not paid by month's end. He needed Edmund dead to inherit and settle his accounts. Alexander took the papers, his hands steady despite the rage building in his chest. Proof. Cold, hard proof that his own blood had tried to murder his brother for money. "We should go," Eleanor said, replacing the ledger. "Before—" Footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, unsteady, accompanied by drunken singing. Reginald was home early. Alexander grabbed Eleanor's hand, pulling her toward the window. They climbed out onto the fire escape as the door to the rooms opened, crouching in the freezing air, while Reginald stumbled inside, oblivious to the intrusion. They did not speak until they reached the carriage, their breath misting in the cold, their hands still linked. "You risked everything," Alexander said, his voice rough. "I kept my promise," Eleanor replied. "Your brother is safe, and now so is your family." She looked up at him, her face pale in the moonlight, her dark eyes endless. Alexander felt something shift inside him, a wall he had built brick by brick over 35 years cracking along its foundation. "Thank you," he said, and the words were inadequate, small things offered in exchange for her courage. "Thank me," Eleanor said, her lips curving in that smile that had started everything, "by building that hospital, by letting me work there, by changing the world, even if only a little." He lifted her hand to his lips, the gesture as natural as breathing, and pressed a kiss to her cold fingers. "I intend to change it a great deal, Miss Ashford, and I find I very much want you beside me while I do." Winter settled over London, with a gentleness that seemed like apology, the fog thinning, the occasional sun breaking through the grey to touch the stone facades of Mayfair. Eleanor moved into a set of rooms above the half-finished hospital in Whitechapel, a space small but her own, with windows that looked east toward the growing light. Alexander visited more often than propriety allowed. At first, he came under the guise of inspecting the hospital's construction, walking the bare corridors with his hands clasped behind his back, asking pointed questions about the ventilation and the placement of the surgical theatre. But always, his path led to Eleanor's rooms, to the cluttered desk where she wrote her case notes, to the chair by the fire where she read medical texts by the dozen. Edmund came too, recovered fully, his colour robust, his step energetic. He brought books and argument and laughter, filling the sparse rooms with a vitality that made Eleanor's heart ache with unexpected affection. "You have turned my brother into a ghost," Edmund observed one afternoon, watching Alexander help Eleanor move a heavy cabinet of medical supplies. "He haunts this place. I barely see him at the estate." "I am not a ghost," Alexander said, grunting slightly with the effort. "I am an investor. I have a right to supervise." "You have a right to nothing. You gave the money. Miss Ashford is doing the work." Edmund grinned at Eleanor. "He is smitten. It is tragic. He used to be terrifying." "Eddie," Alexander warned, "do not Eddie me. I owe this woman my life. The least I can do is ensure she knows what she's getting into. He snores, Miss Ashford, loudly, and he has opinions about wallpaper." Eleanor laughed, the sound bright and unguarded, and Alexander felt something loosen in his chest at the sound. He had not known, until this moment, that his life's ambition had shifted from preserving his family's power to making this woman laugh as often as possible. The days passed in a rhythm of work and quiet companionship. Eleanor treated the poor of Whitechapel, women with coughs that rattled their thin frames, children with fevers that burned too hot, men with injuries from the docks. She worked without discrimination, without judgment, her hands gentle even on the roughest skin. Alexander watched her and learned the language of her care. He learned that she touched every patient twice, once at the beginning of the examination and once at the end, a silent promise that they were not alone. He learned that she hummed when she stitched wounds, old Scottish ballads that seemed to calm even the most agitated sufferer. He learned that she kept a jar of hard candies in her desk for the children, and that she cried silently and fiercely into her pillow when she lost a patient, as she sometimes did. He began to help, not as a physician, for he had no skill there, but as a presence. He carried water, He held frightened hands. He used his title to bully suppliers into delivering clean bandages and fresh medicines when they tried to pawn off rotten stock on the charity hospital. "Why do you do this?" Eleanor asked him one evening, as they sat together in her rooms, the fire burning low, a shared blanket across their knees against the draught. "Because I am tired of being useless," Alexander said honestly. "I have spent my life managing things, estates, investments, political alliances. I have never made anything better. Not really. Not for anyone who needed it." He turned to look at her, the firelight gilding her profile. "You make things better, Eleanor. Every day. I want to learn how." She studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face. "You are not useless, Alexander. You were just waiting for the right battlefield." He reached out, his hand finding hers under the blanket, their fingers intertwining with the inevitability of rain finding the sea. They sat in silence watching the fire, two people who had started as adversaries and found themselves somewhere in the middle, becoming something else entirely. Edmund watched this transformation with the satisfaction of a matchmaker and the terror of a man who knew his brother's capacity for self-destruction. "You will break her heart," he warned Alexander one night at the club. "She is not one of your aristocratic flirtations. She is real. She has scars." "I know," Alexander said. "I have seen them. And you do not care." "I care so much that the thought of being the cause of any new ones keeps me awake at night." Alexander swirled his brandy, watching the amber liquid catch the light. "But Eddie, I have spent my life avoiding risks. I have married my duty, slept with my reputation, and woken every morning to the same cold, safe room. Eleanor is not safe. She is extraordinary, and I find I would rather be burned by her fire than frozen in my own ice." Edmund raised his glass. "To fire, then, and to the poor woman who has no idea what she's getting into." "She knows," Alexander said softly. "She has always known. That is why she smiled." Spring came to London with the stubborn persistence of hope, pushing green shoots through the cracks in the pavement, filling the air with the scent of rain and renewal. The hospital opened its doors on the 1st of May, a modest ceremony, attended by local clergy and a handful of progressive physicians who had heard of the remarkable woman running the wards. Eleanor stood on the steps, her moss-green gown replaced by a simple grey dress suitable for work, her black hair pinned back in a severe chignon that did nothing to diminish the fierce intelligence of her eyes. She accepted the key from Alexander with hands that did not tremble, though her heart raced beneath her ribs. "I give this into your keeping," Alexander said formally, though his eyes held a warmth that made her breath catch. "Do with it what you will." "I intend to change the world," she replied, "or at least this corner of it." The hospital filled quickly. Word spread through Whitechapel that there was a place where the sick could come without fear, where the doctors did not demand payment before treatment, where a woman with dark hair and gentle hands would sit with you through the night, if that was what it took. Alexander came every day. He managed the finances, navigated the bureaucracy, and used his influence to protect Eleanor from the medical establishment that still growled at her heels. Dr. Halloway had not forgotten his humiliation. He circulated rumors, challenged her credentials, tried to have the hospital closed on technicalities, but Eleanor had something Halloway did not. She had the Duke of Ravenscourt standing beside her, not as her master but as her ally, and she had the devotion of the people she served, who would have torn down any wall that tried to keep her from them. The breaking came on a Tuesday, 3 months after the hospital's opening. Eleanor had spent the morning treating a young girl with consumption, holding her hand as the thin chest fought for air, watching the light fade from eyes too young to understand death. She had lost her. She always lost the consumption cases, no matter how hard she fought, and each one carved a new wound in a heart that was already mapped with scars. She retreated to her rooms above the hospital, closing the door, leaning against it, as the grief she had held at bay finally broke through. She slid to the floor, her back against the wood, her knees drawn to her chest, and wept with the silent, violent intensity of someone who had never learned to cry softly. She did not hear the door open. She did not hear footsteps, but suddenly Alexander was there, kneeling beside her, his arms coming around her with a gentleness that shattered what little control she had left. "I could not save her," Eleanor gasped, the words torn from her throat. "She was 8 years old, 8, and I held her hand and I told her it would be all right, and I lied, Alexander, I lied, and she died looking at me with trust in her eyes." "You gave her peace," Alexander said, his voice rough against her hair. "You gave her your presence. That is not nothing, Eleanor. That is everything." "I am not enough," she whispered. "I will never be enough. There are too many of them, and only one of me, and I am so tired." "I know." He held her tighter, rocking her slightly, a movement instinctive and unpracticed. "I know you are tired, but you are not alone. Not anymore." She looked up at him, her face wet, her eyes swollen, her composure in ruins. "I have been alone since I was 20. Since my father died and left me with nothing but his books and his debts. I learned to be strong because I had no choice. But sometimes, Alexander, sometimes I do not want to be strong. Sometimes I want to be held." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears that would not stop falling. "Then let me hold you," he said. "Let me be the strong one. I am very good at being strong. I have been practicing my entire life for exactly this moment." She laughed, a broken, watery sound, and buried her face in his shoulder. He held her until the tears stopped, until her breathing steadied, until the spring twilight painted the room in shades of violet and gold. "I have something to tell you," Alexander said, when she finally lifted her head. "Something I should have said months ago, in a ballroom, when you smiled at death and saved my brother's life." Eleanor waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I love you," Alexander said simply. "Not because you are brilliant, though you are. Not because you are brave, though you are the bravest person I have ever known. I love you because you are the only person who has ever made me want to be better than I am. You are the only person who has ever looked at me and seen not a duke, not a title, not a fortune, but a man. A flawed, frightened, furious man who needed someone to believe he could change." Eleanor touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines of his jaw, the aristocratic features that had seemed so cold when she first saw them, and now seemed so heartbreakingly familiar. "I love you too," she said. "I have loved you since you stood between me and Holloway's men and claimed the right to defend your household. I loved you when you carried water for my patients. I loved you when you sat in the corner of my room and pretended to read while I worked, just so I would not be alone." He kissed her then. Not the perfect kiss of fairy tales, not the chaste brush of courtly love. It was a kiss of lips chapped from winter wind, of salt from her tears, of breath mingling in the aftermath of grief and hope. It was imperfect and desperate, and exactly what they both needed. "I am afraid," Alexander admitted when they finally broke apart, their foreheads touching. "I am afraid I will fail you, that my world will crush you, that the aristocracy will never accept you, and I will spend my life watching them hurt you. Then we will fight them together," Eleanor said, "as we have fought everything else, side by side, equals." "Equals," Alexander repeated, tasting the word. It felt strange and right, like a key turning in a lock he had not known existed. Outside, the hospital hummed with life, with pain and healing, and the messy, beautiful business of being human. And in a small room above it all, a duke and a physician held each other in the growing dark, two warriors who had found that the strongest armor was not made of steel, but of trust. The wedding was small, scandalously so by the standards of the ton. No St. George's, no 300 guests, no breakfast at Almack's. Eleanor wore a simple cream gown, rather than the traditional white, and Alexander stood beside her in a dark coat that had seen better days, his hair falling over his forehead in a way that would have horrified his former valet. Edmund served as best man, looking robust and healthy and insufferably pleased with himself. He had taken to calling Eleanor sister at every opportunity, delighting in the way it made Alexander glower. "You are enjoying this far too much," Alexander muttered, as they waited for the priest to conclude the final blessing. "I was poisoned so that you could meet your wife," Edmund whispered back. "I believe that grants me certain privileges, including the right to gloat for the rest of my natural life." The ceremony concluded. They signed the register. And then, because Eleanor refused to waste a day of her life on celebration when there were patients to see, they walked hand in hand through the streets of Whitechapel to the hospital, accepting the cheers of the neighborhood with bemused grace. That night, after the last patient had been treated and the lamps dimmed, Alexander found Eleanor on the hospital steps, looking up at the stars that managed to pierce London's persistent haze. "What are you thinking?" he asked, settling beside her. "I am thinking about that first night," she said. "The ball, the scream, your brother on the floor and me smiling like a madwoman across the hall." "Why did you smile?" Alexander asked. It was the question that had haunted him for a year, the mystery he had never quite solved. Eleanor turned to him, her dark eyes soft with memory. "Because I saw you," she said. "I saw your face when you ran to him. I saw the love and the terror and the absolute refusal to let him go. And I thought, there is a man who knows how to love completely, a man who has never learned to do anything by half measures." I smiled, because I knew in that instant that if I could save your brother, I might one day have the chance to know what it would feel like to be loved by a man like that. Alexander was silent for a long moment, the weight of her words settling into his bones like warmth. "And now?" he asked. "How does it feel?" Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, her black hair spilling across his chest, her hand finding his in the darkness. "It feels like coming home," she said, "after a very long journey." They sat together as the city breathed around them, the hospital rising behind them like a promise kept. The Duke of Ravenscourt and his unconventional Duchess, two people who had started with a wager and ended with a love that had rewritten the rules of their world. Somewhere above, a star fell, tracing a brief, bright line across the sky. Eleanor closed her eyes and made a wish, not for herself, but for every patient who would walk through those doors, every life she might touch, every heart she might heal. 3 days, she whispered, her old refrain transformed into something new. 3 days, Alexander agreed, lifting her hand to his lips. And every day after. He kissed her then, under the stars, on the steps of the hospital they had built together. It was not a perfect kiss. It was a kiss of laughter and tears, of battle and surrender, of two people who had chosen each other not because it was easy, but because it was right. If you enjoyed this story of love, courage, and the healing power of being truly seen, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to believe that the right person can change everything. Subscribe to the channel for more tales of historical romance, where the heart proves stronger than any title. And leave a comment below telling us which Victorian custom you think was the most ridiculous, from the language of fans to the obsession with mourning jewelry. We read every single one. Curiosity about London. Did you know that during the Victorian era, the city of London was so plagued by fog, or pea soupers as they were called, that the famous thick yellow smog once killed thousands in a single week? The fog was actually a toxic combination of coal smoke and damp air so dense that people literally walked into the Thames because they could not see the river. It was not until the Clean Air Act of 1956 that London finally began to clear its skies. So the next time you see a clear sunset over the Thames, remember that Eleanor and Alexander would have been lucky to see their own hands in front of their faces on a bad winter night.